Please welcome Marijn Huizendveld with his talk, No Code Does Not Mean No Model.
Good morning, everyone. No code does not mean no model. I believe that we should embrace no code to explore more models with the intent to throw most of those models away. You will quickly discover what works and what doesn't in the business process that you're trying to automate. Now, if it matters enough, then you can always extract things into a high-fidelity design in code. My name is Marijn Huizendveld, and I work with leadership teams at scale-ups and other fast-growing organizations, and I help them accomplish more with the teams that they have in their organization by using domain-driven design and associated principles and practices. And so the story that I'll be sharing with you today is based on my observations at what often works out very well and what can be challenging in these types of fast-growing organizations. So my job is done here today if at the end of this I've intrigued you just enough that the next time you're faced with a difficult to solve problem, you're going to reach for no code as one of the ways to experiment and one of the ways to gain fast feedback. But because you will have paid attention, you will not be held hostage by these tools, because you will produce a domain model first with experts in your organization. And as a consequence of modeling with these people, and as a consequence of finding abstractions that really help you solve the problem that you're trying to solve, you're going to be more effective and you're going to actually achieve your goals. Now, if you want a tools comparison, unfortunately, I will not be sharing that with you today, but you can come see me at the end of this talk to share experiences with the various tools that are out there, because there is a plethora of them. If you're looking for a one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately, I don't think there is one, but perhaps you have come across something and you really want to share it with me. So please bring it by the end of the talk, but I'm not going to be presenting one here today. And if you feel you've been seduced to compare code versus code, rather than to say no code can be something that we use in conjunction with all of the other tools that we have, let's talk about that later as well. Because I want to see this as we can use both of these things together. My goal is to start a conversation on no code and domain-driven design, because I think that the future isn't here yet. Right? These tools are in their infancy, and therefore we can shape the future that we want, right? So let's get started with that. So what I will cover in this story are three things. I'll be talking about iterating and why it's valuable and what that actually means for the things that we have to do in our organizations. I'll be talking about artifacts and the various things that we produce when we're modeling and when we're producing software. And I'll be talking about the behavior that is necessary in order to introduce new technology with success in organizations. So let's start with iterating. So this is Ed Sheeran. Who of you knows Ed Sheeran? Look at that. So Ed Sheeran writes songs. Let's see if you know this fella too. This is Neil Gaiman. Who knows him? Actually, two people. Neil Gaiman writes books. He writes novels, science fiction books. And my question to you, what are the commonalities between Ed Sheeran and Neil Gaiman? Fluffy hair. Yeah. Neil Gaiman and Ed Sheeran both have the capacity to produce hit after hit after hit after hit. Neil Gaiman has been awarded with several medals of honor, like I think the Carnegie Medal and a few other very big rewards. Ed Sheeran has produced hit after hit, both for himself but also for other artists. These people have the ability to produce blockbusters. Now you're probably thinking, so what, Marijn? Why do I care? Well, there's this interesting rule of thumb in domain-driven design, and that's we can always explore other domains and learn from them. And then we can look at what we have there and we can copy these things and we can adapt them to our own context. And the thing that we can learn from Ed Sheeran and Neil Gaiman is both of them share a creative process. And the model behind that creative process is the following. Imagine creativity to be a pipeline, right? In order for the creativity to flow, the creativity, it's coming through a pipeline. And before we get to the really good ideas, we must first sort of get rid of the wastewater and the gravel and the dirt and all the different things that are sort of stuck in the pipe, right? So we must first get rid of all the bad ideas before we get to the good ones, right? And so for Ed Sheeran, that translates to writing a song a day. Ed Sheeran writes one song every day, so allegedly 365 songs per year. And if you look at how we can leverage that within our own context, right? One of the things that you can do as a brainstorming activity that I frequently apply myself is whenever I have to get started with something or whenever I'm stuck on something, I think of what's the list of all the bad ideas, right? All the things I really should not be doing in order to be successful with what we're trying to achieve here. And just get all of them out. Like, doesn't matter, just keep on writing, like free listing all the bad ideas. And then you notice that once you're done with that, there's actually room for thinking about the good ones. But ironically enough, quite often, if you take one of the bad ideas and you tweak them just a little, some of those bad ideas somehow can sometimes feel all of a sudden quite genius. So creativity is a pipeline, right? You must get rid of the bad ideas first before you can get rid of the good ones. By the way, does that sound familiar to any of you that sometimes attend other conferences? Throw away the model, is that maybe something you've heard before? This is not just a meme, right? They don't just print it on t-shirts. They even print it on baby rompers, right? Throw away the model is something that we've been saying in the domain-driven design community for a while. But sometimes it still seems that it's a message that's worth repeating and repeating. Now, Ed Sheeran writes one song a day. Does he go to a famous London recording studio every day? No, right? Ed Sheeran is just, sitting by the side of his bed with his guitar, like, is this a good riff? And so writing a song a day means I'll just do it whenever the creativity is there, right? But if we look at how people produce software, then what we do is we quite often always go to the famous London recording studio, right? We try to produce high-quality software at all times. And although the intent of that is admirable, it's not always helpful, right? We all feel, or at least I feel, sometimes ashamed for the bad software that is out there. And I too, for a long time, have always tried to produce high-quality software. But what it limits us to do is it limits us in the sense that we're not exploring more ideas, because writing high-quality software takes time, it takes energy, it takes attention. And therefore, we're by definition exploring less ideas in the same time. So when we think of our design process, we have to be thinking about, where are we in the process, right? Are we at the very first stages where we've just said, this is something that we're going to do? And what good enough constitutes is very different than, for example, after our very first launch, or after, at the moment where our product is at the peak of its productivity and usefulness for the people that use this system. Or finally, at the last stage where we say, we're going to decommission this product eventually, right? So where we are in the design lifecycle, right? Whether we're just jamming out that one song a day, or whether we're now nearing the point where this is a song we found out that resonates with our audience, that determines like what good enough constitutes, right? Whether or not we're going to the recording studio. So I hope by now you realize that overnight success is a myth, right? You can't do like a one-shot perfect design. But why do we aim for these things, right? What is the cause for it? Well, I think one of the reasons for it is that we have this assumption, right? The assumption that we can actually find a single model that will be sort of the perfect answer, right? And so what we want to be doing, and we want to be challenging ourselves to explore those different models. It's our environments, right? To some extent, we have institutionalized perfectionism. And that's okay in certain times in the design life cycle, but we need to be more mindful, in my opinion, about where we are. If we're just jamming out that first song, we want to be, we want to allow ourselves some leniency. And it's personal, right? It is difficult to kill your darlings. It is difficult to say, this idea was interesting, right? But you know what? It's not interesting enough. And one of the problems also is that a lot of people in organizations have gotten punished in the past for iterating, right? You maybe thought like, okay, I'll do this iterating thing, right? And you launch your first version, and then people in the rest of the organization go like, yes, looks good to me. Let's keep this one. It's a keeper, and let's move on to the next project, right? And then the next time you're going to be invited to do an iteration, you're like, yeah, I'm not falling for that trap again. So take a moment and ask yourself, is the organization you work for attempting to achieve an overnight success? So most organizations that I work with attempt an overnight success. Now, I know this evidence is anecdotal. I can only say that the sample size is moderately larger than 30. But I see this happen a lot. So, yeah, iterating is valuable, yet a lot of people have struggled with it. Now, whenever I have a new idea for a presentation like this, I always think, yes, finally, an original thought. And then I read the literature and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Somebody already spoke about this stuff. It was actually already in the Blue Book or in something else that Eric Evans wrote. And so in this case, it was there in the form of the modeling whirlpool. Who has seen this model before? A few hands go up. All right. Now, the idea of the modeling whirlpool is that we're exploring models, right, by just proposing something naive, and that we propose a model, we experiment a bit by using sticky notes or by writing things in code, and then we keep on iterating on it until maybe we challenge it with a new scenario, we turn up the thumb screws, and all of a sudden the model breaks, right? And this is a great way to think about the process, and I have for a considerable amount of time. But there's one problem with it, for me at least, and that is that it makes me think that we're also sort of iterating on the artifact itself, which doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? I think that what this is describing, the whirlpool flow, is describing the process, but not necessarily the artifact. Yet what I see a lot when people talk about iterating is they talk about iterating on the very same thing over and over. But that already limits us to the idea that was originally baked in the very first thing that we started iterating on. And therefore, by definition, it limits us in the number of models that we're exploring, right? So if you think about the modeling whirlpool, it models the flow, but it shouldn't model the artifact, right? So rather than iterating on that single artifact, what we want to be doing is we want to have that those flowing ideas, right? The creativity as a pipeline, just to dismiss many ideas as fast as possible, right? So how can we do that? Well, we can leverage the model that we have and the abstractions that it provides. So one way I like to do that is by using naive modeling in code. And so focusing on a single path, right? For example, a happy path or a specific case, right? And then just writing up some code for it, just introducing types, for example, that leverage the abstractions that we've identified within our model to give them an explicit meaning in our code system, but to not enforce those too much. And then finally to look back at the end of it and ask ourselves, what have we learned? So just as an example, right? Introducing, for example, a type alias, right? Rather than a full-fledged value object, right? This provides us with the abstraction to later on refactor once we have proven sort of the big structure of the model to work and to hold up. And you're probably thinking like, wait a minute, code? Wasn't this a no-code presentation? Yes, we'll get to that later. So what can we learn from Ed Sheeran? Well, make more make more domain models, right? And throw most of those away, right? Ed Sheeran does not release 365 tracks a year, probably an album every 2 years, right? So the vast majority of his ideas are expanded, right? Are thrown away. And discover what resonates, right? Try not to anticipate the future, but just really truly figure it out. So let's talk a bit about artifacts. Throwing away the model, isn't that wasteful? So imagine you pursued a different career, right? One in car design, right? And you do some sketching in the train to work, right? And you show it to your boss, and they say, yes, we'll take it to production right away. How comfortable would you feel with that idea? Probably not, right? And neither do people in the car industry, right? They produce clay prototypes for various reasons. And one of them is really that a car purchase is an emotional purchase, right? And people need to sort of feel like what it will be to experience putting your fingers on the hood of the car, right? And so they go to great lengths to produce these types of artifacts, right? Imagine that you're working for a startup that produces lamp designs for IKEA, right? What would you do? Would you immediately take a new design into production? Or would you maybe first 3D print it to see how it actually distributes the light in various rooms? If this design is actually not just pretty, but also good at its function, making sure that you have a properly lit up room, right? Or maybe you're making a boat with a friend for both of you to go fishing, right? And rather than immediately making the hull for the polyester boat that you're producing, you maybe first make one out of plywood to see if it actually is stable enough for both of you to be stable when you're throwing out your angles, right? So prototypes, they deliver value, right? Prototypes deliver value, but often not for the end user. But that's okay, right? And so there's a bit of friction there also with how we're currently pursuing delivering value in most organizations, because we tend to be overly focused on end user value, but these prototypes can really help us drive end user value up eventually, just not immediately. So what's the concept that is most often misspelled in domain-driven design? Aggregates? No, that's the most misunderstood one. No, it's of course the ambiguous language. No, I'm talking about the ubiquitous language, right? The notion of assigning one term a single meaning within a context, right? Where one word has a single meaning, it's well defined and it's well understood. So I haven't really lived by my own principles here, right? Because I've been talking about prototypes, but I haven't really defined it. And ironically enough, yesterday there was a keynote where somebody mentioned, you know what, the Oxford English Dictionary is not the best way to get to a meaning of a word. Yet here I am. So, a prototype, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is a first or preliminary version of a device or vehicle from which other forms are developed. Okay? So, that's one thing, right? The other thing is, what is no-code, actually? Have you ever asked yourself that? So I've asked myself that question, and to me, no-code is the following. Right? No-code produces working software. The outcome of interacting with a no-code tool is working software. Now, it provides you with a turnkey runtime. Right? You you can start to sign up for a product or purchase a product, and you can immediately start to use it, and it will immediately start to produce working software for you. And finally, it provides you with a visual programming paradigm. And in some cases, it's mostly visual, in the case of low code, and in others, it's entirely visual, in the case of no code. So in order to spare you from listening to no code and low code throughout this entire presentation, I will just be talking about no code, but to the extent of which the programming paradigm is visual, is what is differentiating them. So what kind of products do you have then out there? Well, I'm not going to list the exact tools, but I think there are multiple classes of tools that we can distinguish. And I've found 3 here that are useful in the context of the example that I'll give you. First one is form builders, right? So these are tools that allow you to design a form interaction with an end user. So they allow you to design usable, easy to understand and easy to interact with forms. Examples of this are Typeform or Paperform. And then we have things like automation platforms where they simplify the process of talking to different APIs, and they remove a lot of the busy work there, a lot of the stuff like authenticating and the exchange formats. So think about if this then that, that's one of them, or Pipedream is another one. And these platforms really simplify responding to something and then talking to something else. And another example can be visual databases, right? So effectively the online spreadsheet, but that provides a better application interface around it, or allows you to even design your own application interface around it. So think of like Google Sheets or Airtable. And these types of things allow you to produce useful, helpful interfaces around database management and around data management. So we're at a domain-driven design conference. So what about domain models? How do these tools deal with domain models? Well, domain modeling is not about modeling data. But unfortunately, that's the focus of most of these no-code tools, right? They emphasize the fact that data goes in or data goes out, and they don't necessarily allow you to really do domain modeling. If we think about a domain model is not the entity and the fields that we've assigned to it, or the value objects, right, or the event storming artifact. The model is really the thought bubble that we all have above our heads when we're talking to each other about the problem that we're solving, right? So all of these things, they're just a manifestation of that model, right? So if you think about that, we shouldn't really be too attached to how we can model in these tools. That doesn't necessarily have to limit us, right? Because we can BYOM, right? We can bring your own model. So the thing with no-code is about the absence of code, as wireless is about the absence of wires, as serverless is about the absence of servers, right? This is a quote by Romeo Mora. It's not like the code is no longer there because we're interacting with this system, right? It's still there, but it changes the dynamics of the relationship that we now have with the code, right? And that's important to consider because we always say in domain-driven design that we want to bind the model to the implementation, right? That we want to make sure that concepts within our domain model have a representation in code, so that if somebody in the organization starts to leverage our model, we can actually also translate that to a working implementation. So if no code is not about the absence of code, right? It's really, that sort of informs also the fact that software production is also more than writing code, right? The fact that we no longer have to write code doesn't mean that we no longer have to do architecture. It doesn't mean that we no longer have to do testing. It doesn't mean that we no longer have to think about all of the itties like security, availability, etc. All of those things are still relevant, right? Just one of the things that we had to do now takes up significantly less time. So let's talk about an example, okay? So imagine that we're working for a startup, actually no longer a startup. They already achieved product market fit, right? And they're branching out into the rest of their continent, the rest of Europe. And they realize that although their product is pretty good and people want to pay money for it, their whole sign-up process is terrible. And so what they want to do, they realize that there is people falling off the funnel, right? Falling out of the funnel. And so what they want to do is they want to really improve that, right? So we have this timeline, and in the first bit of the timeline, that's where people actually sign up for the product, right? And where we want to do conversion optimization, where we want to get better at what we're trying to achieve, getting people to use our product and getting people to buy our product, to pay for it, right? So we want to improve conversion in this area. And then there is the fact that once they have said, yes, I would like the product, we also need to set the customer up for success, right? We have to onboard them into the product. And then between them, there is this touch point, right? So we're doing some event storming with this within this organization, right? And we're figuring out like all of the information that we have to ask from the customer, right? We need to know quite a few things for them to be successful using our product, right? We're modeling with different people in the organization. So yeah, it's an NDA-compatible version of an event storming artifact. But you can see the red ones. The red ones are questions, right? These are assumptions. We're like, is this really like it should be? So we have a real model, but we also have many assumptions baked into it, right? We're now at the halfway point. And then in the second bit, right? In the second bit, we have to interact with all of these systems in order to onboard the customer, right? We need to make sure that we're inviting their colleagues. We need to make sure that we run the know your customer check to make sure there's no bad actors in our system. We need to set up the payment processing. We need to make sure that invoicing is working. All of that is, in various legacy systems, including Google Sheets probably. And we need to interact with that. But not all of that is straightforward. And not for not all of those interactions, we actually have all the answers. Because some of the people that have produced these systems have long left the startup, right? So what's the case is that the stuff in the beginning, right, around conversion optimization is influencing things at the end and the other way around, right? So we have challenges here, right? There's many moving parts, as you've seen. There are many assumptions. Those were all the red sticky notes. And one part influences the other, right? So you couldn't just get started building it and just assume like, YOLO, it will work, because that's pretty risky, right? And because we're dealing with conversion optimization, we also have to realize that human behavior is impossible to predict, right? We can put a button somewhere, but within the conversion optimization domain, people know that the heuristics can work very well for one audience, but work totally bad on another audience. So you really have to figure out what works. You can't just ask people by showing them a paper prototype, because that's like asking your mom, hey mom, would you buy this product that I've made? Your mom is always going to say yes to that because she loves you. So if you're actually interested in that topic, there's a great book on it. It's called The Mom Test. It's a book by Rob Fitzpatrick. And he helps you shape questions that prevent you to get the mom-like answer, like, yeah, sure, I want the button there, or yes, this is a feature I want. So if you're a product owner or somebody that is interested in this topic, it's a really great book. But as good as this book is, sometimes the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So we have to produce a real thing to see if people are truly going to push that button, right? And so I think that this is a situation that provides us with an opportunity to explore a domain model using no code. So, it's tempting when we want to explore something to start at the beginning. But there's this book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it's written by Stephen Covey. And he figured out clickbait titles long before we had clickbait, right? This book is pretty old. And he put a number in the title, which is a great way to get people to click your link. But it's a great book. And there are 7 principles in there. And one of them is begin with the end in mind. So rather than starting at the beginning, what you want to do is you want to start at the end of something and then work your way backwards to the beginning, because it's a lot easier to do that, right? If you have the final thing, it becomes easier to reason about how you want to deconstruct that, or what the first possible thing could be to improve this, to modularize this, for example. And it's actually something that has been copied by the domain-driven design community when we're doing event storming. There is this thing called reverse the narrative, and that's actually this principle at work. So begin with the end in mind allows you to understand the whole before you start to deconstruct in parts. And that is very valuable because despite how much we're doing in terms of communicating, miscommunications do happen, even on teams that are working very intensively together on producing a shared model, right? We can still fly at different levels of altitude sometimes and mistake each other's words for something else. And once we have that end product in mind, it becomes very straightforward to figure out like how we want to be sequencing the work, right? Not prioritizing, but sequencing the work. How can we cut this up in parts, and what parts do we do first and what parts do we do last? And if you think with that end in mind, right, and we start to deconstruct it, that's also when we can start to look at like other things, other practices, such as context mapping. Like, okay, now that we know what the whole thing looks like and we've seen that we don't have any assumptions that we can't disprove, how are we going to chunk this thing up in, for example, bounded contexts? So let's talk about the value of no-code now, right? So in this process, right, no-code can provide value. If we're interacting with all of those legacy systems, perhaps we can't immediately do that right away, so it allows us to fake some of these things, right? Those automation platforms allow us to do that. Or they allow us to more quickly talk to some of these endpoints because we don't have to set up OAuth for 7 of these services, right? So they remove busy work. Then they help shorten the feedback loop because of that, right? Because we no longer have to get started with designing a form library. We can actually immediately produce a pretty usable form that helps us understand whether the model that we've introduced for doing conversion optimization is actually working. And because it helps us shorten the feedback loop, it helps us prove or disprove assumptions quickly. Now, there's obviously also downsides, right? So if you're going to use these tools for doing prototyping, then what happens is you're in an authoring environment that actually is designed and is encouraging you to produce a production-grade artifact. And so you can get tempted to produce a production-grade solution, which might not be necessary at this stage of the design lifecycle. Think about that timeline that I showed you. If we're just trying to figure out what works, we're like Ed Sheeran. We don't want to be in the recording studio right away. There is lock-in on platforms. If we're not mindful about how we're decomposing, right? If we're not leveraging at least abstractions that we've introduced in our domain model, then we'll definitely get locked into these platforms. And scaling can be hard, right? So if we do have something where we're actually moderatively happy and it's not something where we expect a lot of change to happen, right? It's okay to have it in that product, but you have to be mindful that not a lot of those products are actually designed with scaling in mind. Now, there's very many benefits too. First of all, I think that because we're quickly making something rather than slowly making something, there's less attachment to the artifact, right? It will be a little easier to throw it away. It's still difficult, but it's a little easier if you spend 1 day on it versus 2 weeks. Another benefit is that because these tools are visual, right, the authoring environment, right, the group of authors that can interact with the artifact is significantly larger than when it's just code, right? We can now have more people modify some of these things, and that allows us to have more iterative approach to the work. And because it was quick to make, it's also cheap to replace, right? So it allows us to think in terms of like little proof of concepts, right? And if it's proven to be something valuable that we want to implement in code, we can easily and cheaply replace it. Now, maybe you're thinking, Marijn, that sounds lovely, but what about my legacy? Exactly. What about your legacy? So, legacy systems do not have to stand in between you and success, right? Legacy systems and their interaction is something that we can model for. So in the example of event storming, what we can do is we can model these things as external systems that we interact with, where we're sending command and outcome domain events, right? And so we can leverage these things, right, in our domain model to interact with a legacy system. And initially, this is just part of our model, right? This is what we are trying to prove, and we know that there's a few assumptions in like how we want to be interacting with that. Those assumptions need to be verified probably by really playing with the actual API, and we have to find the easiest way to do that, whether that's Postman or maybe an automation platform. But what we can definitely do is we can use a tool to mock out this interaction, and that can really help us make the feedback loop a lot faster. So what do you think? If the prototype is any good, should it stay in no-code? It depends. Exactly. It depends. The classic consultant answer. So it depends on what exactly. Should it stay in no-code? Well, I think there are a bunch of concerns that you have to take into account. First of all is the rate of change. How frequently do we expect changes to happen in this part of the system, right? So if it's an area where there is little to no change to be expected, well, then maybe it's okay that it's not super neatly designed in that no-code tool. But obviously, what constitutes high rate of change or low rate of change is a question that you then need to really answer with an honest heart, right? What are the expectations that people have of this part of the service? And I'm saying the service as in the product, not the technical term. So how do people expect to interact with it, right? What type of expectations do they have of how much it's going to be up? So that's another aspect of it. And are we able, right? Have we introduced sufficient amount of decoupling by leveraging the model? Are we using interfaces one way or another to be able to replace this bit, yes or no? If we've done that, if we've done a good enough job at that, we might know that this is not perfect, and that's not something that will scale to the height of the heights that the product that we're making we expect to take it to. But it might be good enough for now, and having a little bit of observability around it, have some tripwires, so that we know when we're making mistakes, that can be sufficient. So should it stay in no-code? The rate of change, service expectations, and decoupling using interfaces. Those are some of the characteristics that you can take into account to answer that question. So let's talk a bit about the behavior that is necessary to adopt new technology with success. So this is Eliyahu Goldratt, and he is mostly known for his book called The Goal, in which he coined the theory of constraint, but he shared many more useful insights with us while his time on Earth. So one of the things that he said is technology can bring benefits if and only if the technology diminishes a limitation, right? So technology can bring benefits if and only if it diminishes a limitation. So the problem is that before the technology arrived, long before the technology arrived, we introduced rules, policies, guidelines, behavior to accommodate the limitation being there. And if we're introducing new technology without thinking about those rules, we're not going to be successful. And you can imagine that imagine yourself, right? And it's 10, 12 years ago, right? You're working at a company, a big corporate, and you want to get a new server for your project. And you have to fill out a bunch of forms, and it will take you 6 months to wait for it. And you're like, you know what? We can use something like the cloud because it doesn't take that long to order servers. We don't have to rack them ourselves. It's just pushing a button and it's there. The fact that you can now push a button in Amazon Web Services to get you an EC2 instance is not the only thing that we have to take away and change, right? We also have to change all of the rules within the organization that have been introduced, right, to accommodate the limitation of how long it took to purchase and rack a server, right? And so if we don't change those rules, it will probably still take us maybe not 6 months anymore, but probably 5 or 4. So you're not really getting the value out of this, right? So we have to look at the rules. And so I have some recommendations for you, right? 2 years ago, I was at this conference, at the Unconference, and I did a session on this. And I asked people about what we think the rules should be. So what's the power of the technology? What's the power of the technology of no-code? Well, there's less things that require deep technical knowledge, right? You can now, you don't necessarily have to be an engineer, right, to produce software. Lay people can produce, simple forms, right? If you're not if you're not feeling completely uncomfortable around technology, you'll be able to produce working software, right? So there are less things that require deep technical knowledge. So what limitation does it diminish? Well, it diminishes the need for a large engineering team to produce working software, right? We can now do that with fewer people, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be more efficient. Until now, what were the rules that we had in order to deal with the limitation? So the rules up until now, and there are more, but a few of them that I want to share with you, is in a lot of organizations, we favor the predictable over the innovative because it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of attention of the organization, and therefore predictable is more valuable than innovative, right? So that's one of the rules. As a consequence of that, we're also doing big design upfront, right? Because we have this group of expensive people, we don't want them to be working on stuff that is actually wrong, right? So that's why we produce big design upfront. And as a consequence of that, we also do not discard things, right? Because discarding is wasteful, it's risky, And so the rules are do not discard any of the things that you're producing. And we're sort of favoring finishing over succeeding with the project, right? Because again, it's difficult to change also. And as a consequence, what you see a lot of organizations do also, right, is because they just want to be finishing, they outsource a lot of the work, which doesn't necessarily always help. And we keep on reworking the same artifact rather than replacing things, right? So what do I think that the rules should be given this new technology, right? And I think it actually should just be one idea, and it boils down again to Ed Sheeran, right? We should optimize for the throughput, right, by reaching a volume of bad ideas fast. Because the thing is, now that you're removing the bottleneck of writing software as being the limitation to writing code as being the limitation of writing software, what you're going to do is you're going to expose actually other limitations that exist within the organization. And yesterday I attended a talk by Ornella, and she shared a similar experience where they'd done some team redesign and that exposed other problems in the organization. You will find that with this as well, right? As soon as you start to remove one limitation, it starts to expose others, right? And so what we have to do is we have to make sure that limitations in the availability of domain experts, for example, is not going to be the factor that is actually now limiting the throughput of your project, right? So looking back on iterating, right? No code helps us shorten the feedback loop, right? You have to bring your own domain model into the tools, right? Because the tools don't necessarily encourage you to do domain modeling. If at all, they encourage you to do data modeling. If you begin with the end in mind, you can discover the parts. On artifacts, not all artifacts add value to users, and that's okay, right? If it's useful to disprove our assumptions, that is good enough, right? It helps us to dismiss those bad ideas to get to the good ones. And by identifying the bigger picture, right, we can find the artifacts that we really truly care about, the stuff that we really want to be doing in code because it's going to change a lot, because that's where the secret sauce is. It helps us identify the areas that we're looking for. Behavior, no more writing code as the limitation for writing good software. That means that we want to think about the fact that software production is more than writing code. And so we have to look at what things would limit us in doing that, right? Making sure that we have, for example, sufficient access to domain experts, because that is most likely now to become one of our limitations. So in short, use no code to explore more models with the intent to throw most of those models away, where you quickly discover what works and what doesn't, right? And you can always extract to code if needed. So I have some final words. We are nowhere near the era of laypeople producing complex software that works. Armies of programmers with rudimentary skills can produce certain kinds of software, but not the kind that saves a company at its 11th hour. What is needed is for tool builders to put their minds to the task of extending the power and productivity of talented software programmers. What is needed is sharper ways of exploring domain models and expressing them in code. I look forward to using tools that are designed for this purpose. And don't take my word for it, because these were actually the final words of Eric Evans in a seminal book of domain-driven design. So my goal was to start a conversation on no-code and domain-driven design. So let's start talking. I want to thank you, and specifically Romeo, Konstantin, Martin, Teun, and Kenny, the team at Marking, Julian, and Verena. If you like this presentation, tell your friends, tell your boss, and tell the internet. And if you're eager to learn more, you can reach out to me. Have a great conference and have a great day.